room smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet. I noticed that first. Before I noticed my mother sitting 3 rows ahead of me, before I noticed my brother beside her, before I noticed the way neither of them turned around even though I had walked through the same door they walked through maybe 20 minutes apart. I sat in the back. That was intentional. I chose the seat closest to the exit, the one with the scratched armrest and the slightly uneven leg that made the whole chair tilt forward just enough to be uncomfortable. I chose it anyway. I didn't want anyone to think I was there to make a scene. I wasn't. I was there because she was my sister, and she was in trouble, and I still showed up for people who wouldn't show up for me. That's the thing about being the one who is always called too soft. You never quite stop being soft even when you've earned every reason to be hard. My sister's name is Camille. She's 3 years older than me. Growing up, she was the one everyone called effortless, the one who got the compliments at dinner without trying, the one my mother introduced first at family gatherings, the one who got the car at 16 while I took the bus until I was 19. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I used to. For a long time I did. But somewhere between 30 and 32, I stopped being bitter and started being just tired. Tired of carrying a feeling that heavy when she wasn't even thinking about me. The charge was her 3rd DUI. 3rd. I want you to understand what that means. Not legally. Though legally it means felony charges in this state, potential prison time, mandatory treatment. I mean what it means in the context of a family that spent years telling me I was the one who would amount to nothing. The one who made bad choices. The one who was an embarrassment. Camille had wrapped her car around a guardrail at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. No one else was hurt, thank God. But the arresting officer noted she could barely stand and the blood test came back at nearly twice the legal limit. This was not a lapse. This was a pattern. And my family, my mother, my older brother, they've been calling lawyers within the hour, pulling strings, making calls, rallying around her like they always did. No one called me. I found out from a cousin who texted me a news link 3 days later. By then, I had already cleared my schedule. I should explain something. I know it sounds strange, showing up for someone who doesn't show up for you. People ask me that sometimes. Friends, colleagues, even my therapist once, gently, with that careful tone she uses when she thinks I'm about to make a decision that will hurt me. Why do you keep going back? She asked, not accusatory, just curious. I told her the truth. I don't go back for them. I go back for the version of me that would have wanted someone to show up. That 10-year-old who sat at the kitchen table while everyone else laughed in the living room. I show up for her. And also, I needed to see it with my own eyes. That Camille was okay. Even after everything. Even after the thing that happened 4 years ago, which I will get to. My name is Iris. I'm 33. I grew up in a mid-sized city in the South, the younger of 3 children. The only one who left. The only one who didn't come back. My mother always described our family to outsiders as close-knit. She used that phrase the way people use "we're working on it" to describe something that has never actually been true, but that they've said out loud so many times it started to feel real. My father died when I was 12. What followed was a kind of reorganization, not grief, exactly, but a reshuffling of roles. My brother became the man of the house, a title he wore like a costume that didn't quite fit but that he refused to take off. My mother became the keeper of appearances. Camille became the favorite, and I became the project, the one who needed fixing, the one who asked too many questions, who didn't dress right, who brought home friends they didn't approve of, who went to a college 2 states away and didn't apologize for it. When I got into my graduate program, my mother said, "That's nice, but what does that even lead to?" When I got my first real job, my brother said, "Don't forget where you came from." When I told them I was being considered for something I wasn't sure about yet, something that felt too big to say out loud, Camille laughed. She said, "You always did have a big head," and my mother smiled like it was a joke they were all in on. That was 4 years ago. The last time I sat at that kitchen table, I left the next morning and I did not go back. The courtroom was on the 3rd floor. I took the stairs. I don't know why, habit maybe, or the quiet need to arrive having done something physical, having burned off some of the nervous energy that had been sitting in my chest since I'd booked the flight. The stairwell smelled like industrial cleaner and old wood. My heels were louder than I wanted them to be. I found a seat in the back of the gallery. The hearing hadn't started yet. There were maybe 30 people in the room, other cases, other families, the particular mix of boredom and dread that lives in courtrooms. I spotted my mother's coat before I spotted her. That dusty rose color she's worn for 20 years. The one she thinks looks elegant, and maybe it does. I've never been able to decide. She was in the third row, and my brother was beside her, and they were leaning together, talking quietly, and neither of them looked toward the back. I kept my head down. I had worn my hair differently than usual. Not as a disguise. That's not what it was. I just hadn't wanted the distraction of being recognized before the hearing started. I wanted to just be there, quietly, in the back. That was the plan. Camille came in from the side door with her attorney. She looked thin. She looked tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix, that particular exhaustion that comes from living wrong for too long. She was wearing a blazer that looked borrowed. Her hair was pulled back. She scanned the gallery. I saw her eyes move across the rows, and when they reached the back, they stopped. She saw me. I held her gaze. I didn't smile. I didn't wave. I just held her gaze for a moment, and then she looked away, and I saw her jaw tighten, and I saw her say something to her attorney, and her attorney glanced back briefly, and then they both looked forward. My mother had not turned around. The bailiff asked everyone to rise. The judge entered. His name, I would later read in the court record, was the Honorable Charles Whitmore. He was maybe 60, with reading glasses. He pushed up his nose as he settled into his chair and began reviewing the file in front of him. He had the look of someone who had seen a great deal and been impressed by very little of it. He looked up once, scanning the room the way judges do, not really seeing individuals, just taking in the general shape of things. And then he looked at me. And then he looked back at the file. And then he looked at me again. The second look was different. I felt it before I understood it. That particular quality of being recognized in a place where you did not expect to be recognized. It's different from being seen. Being seen happens in degrees. Someone notices your face, notices your expression, files it away. Being recognized is sudden. It has a temperature. It changes the air in the room. Judge Whitmore set down his pen. He looked at his clerk, said something quietly. The clerk looked up, looked at me, looked back at the judge. The attorney for the prosecution glanced over. The court reporter paused. My mother still hadn't turned around. The judge cleared his throat. He said, and his voice was measured, careful, the voice of someone choosing every word. Before we proceed, I need to note something for the record. I want to confirm the presence of. He paused, took off his reading glasses. I want to confirm, are you Dr. Iris Calloway, of the State Medical Board? The room shifted. I don't know how else to describe it. There was a physical change in the energy of the space, the way the air changes right before a storm, a collective stillness, an intake of breath that wasn't quite audible but that you could feel. I stood up. Yes, I said, I am. My mother turned around. I will carry the image of her face turning around for the rest of my life. The way the recognition moved across it in stages, confusion first, then something sharper, then a blankness that was worse than either. My brother's face beside her went rigid. He put his hand on her arm. I don't know if it was to steady her or to stop her from saying something. Camille, from the defendant's table, had closed her eyes. The judge said, Dr. Calloway, I need to disclose for the record that I sat on the ethics review panel that evaluated your testimony 3 years ago. That constitutes a prior professional relationship. I am obligated to recuse myself from this proceeding. He said it plainly, matter-of-factly, the way you state something that is simply true. I'll be requesting an immediate replacement. Court will recess for 30 minutes. He stood. The bailiff asked everyone to rise. Judge Whitmore paused at the edge of the bench, and he looked at me, not with familiarity, not with warmth exactly, but with a kind of recognition that was something like respect, and he gave a single brief nod before he left the room. The doors closed behind him, and then the room erupted, quietly, in the way courtrooms do. Whispers, shuffling, people leaning toward each other. The prosecutor's assistant leaned over and said something to the lead attorney. 2 people in the gallery ahead of me turned to look at me, then turned back. I heard someone near the front say my name. My mother was still turned around looking at me. I met her eyes. I did not look away first. Let me back up. Because this doesn't make sense without the 4 years. When I told my family at that kitchen table that I was being considered for a position on the state medical board, I wasn't sure yet. I was terrified to say it out loud. I was 30 and I had worked every single day since I was 22 with a single-mindedness that had cost me relationships and sleep and a lot of weekends I'll never get back. I had a medical degree I'd funded with loans and scholarships and a part-time job that I worked through my second year of residency. I had built something. I was still building it. And when Camille laughed and said, "You always did have a big head," my mother didn't correct her. My brother said, "Better not to count your chickens." And I remember sitting there thinking, these people don't know who I am anymore. Maybe they never did. I didn't fight back. I finished my meal. I washed my dish. I went to bed in my childhood bedroom with the glow-in-the-dark stars I'd stuck to the ceiling in 1999 still there, and I lay there for a long time in the dark looking at them. In the morning, I left early. I left a note that said I'd had to get back for work. I drove 4 hours without stopping. 3 months later, I was appointed. I didn't call to tell them. I told myself it was because they wouldn't have understood. That's true. But the fuller truth is that I needed something, finally, that was just mine, that they hadn't touched with their doubt, that they hadn't taken even a small piece of credit for. I wanted one thing in my life that existed entirely outside of their narrative about who I was, so I kept it. For 4 years, they didn't know. Or I thought they didn't know. Camille had said she'd mocked my campaign. I learned later that's what she said to the table when my name came up at a family dinner she'd had. Apparently, she pointed to an article on her phone and said something dismissive, and my mother had changed the subject, and my brother had said he'd heard something about it and that was that. They'd filed it under things they didn't want to deal with. That's the thing about being erased by people. When you come back as something undeniable, they don't celebrate. They just go quiet. Erasure is more comfortable to them than revision. During the recess, I sat in a hallway on a wooden bench. I had a bottle of water I'd bought from the vending machine downstairs. I had my phone, which had 17 new notifications that I was not going to look at. I had the particular stillness that comes after something large and inevitable has finally happened. Not relief, not triumph, something simpler, something like, okay, so now it's real. My brother found me 7 minutes in. He came around the corner and stopped when he saw me, and for a moment neither of us said anything. He looked older. There's something about seeing someone you grew up with and realizing that time has happened to them the same way it's happened to you, that they're not the fixed point you've been carrying in your memory. They've been living a whole life you weren't watching. He said, "Iris." I said, "Hey." He sat down on the bench, not next to me, a few feet away. He looked at his hands. "I didn't know you were going to be here," he said. "I know. Mom didn't know either. I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She's really sick, you know. Camille, not just this. There's something real going on." I said, "I know. That's why I'm here." He looked at me then, really looked, and I could see him doing the math, slowly, the way you do when a story you've been telling yourself for years doesn't quite add up anymore. The version of me he'd been carrying, the little sister, the problem, the one with the big head, and the version sitting in front of him on this bench, with a title that had just cleared a federal courtroom, and the measured quiet of someone who had nothing left to prove. He said, "I'm sorry we didn't, when you got the appointment, we should have called." I thought about what to say. I said, "Yeah, you should have." Not angry, not letting him off the hook, just, "True." He nodded. We sat there until they called the room back to order. The second judge was younger. She moved through the paperwork efficiently, asked my presence to be noted for the record, accepted the recusal documentation, and rescheduled the hearing for 3 weeks out. Standard procedure. She thanked the gallery for their patience. I thought, this is what it looks like when institutions work the way they're supposed to. I thought I spent years in rooms like this, learning that, building toward that. While my family was at kitchen tables deciding who I was going to be, my mother was waiting for me outside. She had her hands clasped in front of her, holding that dusty rose coat closed even though it wasn't cold. She looked at me the way she used to look at me when I was 11 and I'd said something she didn't know how to respond to, that particular expression of a person encountering something slightly beyond their framework. She said, "I didn't know you'd be here." I said, I know. How long is it? I mean, the board position. How long? 4 years. She pressed her lips together. Her eyes were wet. I noticed that. I didn't look away from it, but I also didn't move toward it. I have spent too many years watching my mother's tears redirect conversations that needed to stay difficult. She said, I always knew you'd do something. And here's the thing I will tell you about that sentence. She meant it as a kindness. She meant it as a revision, a retroactive claim on pride, a way of sliding herself into the story of who I had become. She wasn't lying. She probably believed it in that moment. But I heard it for what it was. I said, Mom, that's not what you said. She blinked. When I told you. At the table. That's not what anyone said. She opened her mouth, closed it. I said, I'm not here to fight. I'm here because Camille needed someone to show up. But I need you to understand something. I paused. Let the sentence have weight. The person standing in front of you. I built her. Not because of the way you raised me, in spite of some of it, and I'm done pretending otherwise. My mother looked at me for a long time. I don't know what she was feeling. I'm not sure she knew either. She said finally, quietly, I hear you. Not I'm sorry. Not you're right, just I hear you. I decided in that moment that it was enough, not because it was everything I'd wanted, because I had stopped needing everything I'd wanted from her a long time ago, and I had gotten very good at taking what was real and leaving the rest. I said, let me know how the rescheduled hearing goes. And I walked to the parking garage. I drove to the airport. I had a 4-hour layover, so I found a seat by a window and I watched the planes. There's something I have always loved about airports, the functional democracy of them. Everyone moving, everyone going somewhere, no one required to explain why they left or what they left behind. I thought about Camille. I hope she gets help. I mean that with no conditions attached, which is something I've had to practice. Hoping for someone without requiring them to be different first. She has a problem that is bigger than this courtroom, bigger than our family's narrative about her, bigger than what any hearing outcome will fix. I hope she finds her way to the other side of it. I thought about my brother. I think he's a man who knows, on some level, that he's been playing a role that doesn't fit him. That's a hard thing to carry and a harder thing to put down. I don't know if he'll put it down, but I think the conversation on that bench was the most honest thing we've said to each other in 20 years, and I'm gonna let that mean something. I thought about my mother. I hear you. That's what she said. I used to need more than that. I needed her to understand, to apologize, to see the specific weight of every specific silence. Now I think. She said, I hear you. She is 64 years old and she was raised by people who never said even that much. I hear you. That is not nothing. I'm not saying I forgive it all. I'm not saying the kitchen table didn't happen, or the years of it, or the specific thing it does to a child to be the one who is always almost not enough. I'm saying I've decided not to let it be the story I tell about myself. The story I tell about myself is this. I grew up in a house where I was invisible. I left that house and I built something real with my hands, alone, over years, from nothing but stubbornness and a willingness to be uncomfortable. I became someone who makes decisions that matter for people I will never meet. I walked into a courtroom where I was supposed to be just another person in the gallery, and the judge stopped what he was doing because of something I had built. Not because of where I came from. Because of where I went. On the plane home, the woman beside me asked what I did for work. I told her. She said, that sounds important. I looked out the window. The city was getting smaller below us, its grid softening into shapes, its shapes softening into color. It is, I said, and I meant it without apology, without the old reflexive need to follow it with something smaller, something that made the claiming of it more comfortable for whoever was listening. Just, it is. The clouds came up around us and the city disappeared and I leaned my head against the cool of the window and I thought about the girl with the glow-in-the-dark stars who lay in the dark and decided, quietly, not to stay. She got out. And every morning since, she has been building the life that made leaving worth it. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since that day in the courtroom. Not in a grand cosmic way. Just in the plain, honest way you think about things, when the noise settles and you're sitting by a window on a plane watching a city shrink beneath you. Every choice I made led to that room. And every choice my family made led them to be sitting in it without knowing who I had become. That's not a coincidence. That's just how things work. When my mother let Camille's laughter go uncorrected at that kitchen table, she made a choice. When my brother said, "Don't count your chickens," he made a choice. When I got up the next morning, drove 4 hours without stopping, and decided I was done needing their belief in order to keep going, I made a choice too. None of those choices were neutral. They all went somewhere. What I keep coming back to is this: the people who doubted me didn't make me successful, but they did make me unafraid of being alone while I built something. There's a particular kind of freedom that comes from having nothing to lose socially in a room. When you've already been written off, you stop performing for the audience. You stop building for approval. You start building because the work itself is the point, because you believe in it even when no one else does. Because the alternative, staying small so they feel comfortable, was never actually an option you could live with. That's what I mean when I say I built this myself. Not that I had no help along the way. I had mentors, colleagues, people who took a chance on me in small and large ways. What I mean is that the engine was mine. The stubbornness, the willingness to be uncomfortable for years, the decision, made quietly in a childhood bedroom with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling, that the story they were telling about me was not the only story available. Iris, the woman I became, was not built in spite of pain. She was built through it, because of what she chose to do with it. She didn't let it make her cruel. She didn't let it make her bitter, though she was, for a while. She let it make her focused. That's the part I want to be honest about, because I think people skip over it. There was a long season in the middle where I was angry, where I rehearsed conversations in my head, where I wanted recognition and got silence and had to learn, slowly and imperfectly, how to keep moving without it. Anger is not the enemy. Anger tells you something true about what you value and what you deserved. The question is, what you do with it. I chose to convert mine. Every time I wanted to call home and prove something, I'd put that energy back into the work. Every time I felt the old ache of not being enough for them, I reminded myself that enough is a standard you can set for yourself. The courtroom moment. Judge Whitmore stopping the proceeding, the room going still, my mother finally turning around. That wasn't my victory. It was just the consequence. A visible, undeniable consequence of years of invisible choices made in the right direction. I don't need them to understand everything. I just need to keep choosing correctly, one day at a time, for my own sake, not theirs. That's what I know now that I didn't know at that kitchen table. You don't build a life to prove something to someone else. You build it because you are the one who has to live inside it, and you want it to be worth living in. The proof is just what happens when the building is real.